Welcome back to the Explanation Pro. Today I'll recap a sci-fi film called Bloodstorm. Spoilers incoming. The movie is loosely based on the conspiracy theory that the Nazis had set up a military base in Antarctica. At the beginning of the film, Dr. Joseph Mengele attempts to board a plane along with other German soldiers. They carry a mysterious machine into the plane as the Americans arrive and begin to open fire on them to prevent the Germans from leaving. Despite the Americans' attempts, the plane manages to leave for an unknown destination. In the present day, two researchers are doing fieldwork. One of them, Mark, contacts Niflheim station for a status report. He then begins to ask May, the person taking the report, out for a coffee date. The other researcher, Paige, starts a machine to drill down the ground. She turns it off once it hits metal and digs through the snow to find whatever it hit. They uncover something that has the swastika on it before a soldier with a gas mask grabs them from behind. More people wearing gas masks emerge and one of them knocks Mike down. They drag the two away as another one takes out a stick grenade and throws it toward the researcher's machine, destroying it. Meanwhile, back in Niflheim station, Dr. Moss finds a suspicious petri dish after one researcher almost trips while carrying a tray. He asks the researcher where he got it, to which the researcher answers that it was from Dr. Riestad. Riestad is in the middle of a class when Moss confronts him. They enter Riestad's office and begin arguing about how the petri dish and its contents, which is apparently a flesh-eating bacteria called Vibrio vulnificus. Moss begins to yell at Riestad and the researchers in his class begin to choose who between the two men would win in a fight. Moss calms down and brings up how Riestad previously infected his unit with an influenza virus as an experiment, to which Riestad counters that a vaccine was made because of that experiment. Moss then says that Riestad had lost a lot of people assigned to the station during his 10 years as station chief. May interrupts their argument to say that Paige and Mark haven't updated their status, which pushes the other researchers to conduct a search party. They go to the site where Paige and Mark last were. They find blood on the snow as well as footprints and drag marks. The group begins to follow these tracks. Meanwhile, Mark begins to wake up. Paige asks him if the bleeding on his head stopped and he answers yes before asking who their captors were. She says that military exercises aren't allowed in Antarctica and that two wonders why the men's uniforms have swastikas on them, just as the men enter the room. One of the men points at Mark and two of them drag him out of the room. Paige tries to follow but gets pushed back by a soldier. The other researchers continue their search, with Moss walking ahead while the others ride a vehicle. Mark wakes up strapped on a surgical table and without clothes. Mengele then enters the room, dressed in a lab coat. Mark tries to ask him who he was and what he was going to do, but Mengele doesn't answer him. Instead, he picks up a scalpel and makes an incision on Mark's forehead. Mengele then reaches for his forehead and rips the skin off, causing Mark to scream. Paige hears his screams and she cries. The search party reaches the end of the tracks, which leads them to a huge hole. Moss climbs down in hopes of finding Mark and Paige, even if Riestad tries to stop him as he says that it's too dangerous. Riestad and the other researchers eventually go down the hole too. They then notice that there is a warm breeze and they find that it came from a tunnel. They then start their trek through the tunnel. Meanwhile, a soldier gives Paige some food and a fork. She waits for her to leave before grabbing the fork and running through the halls. Paige reaches the infirmary and looks at the first bed. She sees that the patient on that bed looks like Mark, though the skin on his face looks decayed and there are stitches on the sides. She tells him that everything was going to be alright before hearing gargled noises on another bed. Paige cautiously approached the bed to see what was making the noise. She turns the light on and sees a skinless person that asks for her help and calls her name. She realizes that that was Mark and she backs away out of fear. She bumps into the patient in the first bed and tries to stab him with the fork. He catches her hand and picks the fork out of her hands before asking her in German what was going on. Paige then punches him and runs away. An alarm rings through the facility as Paige enters a room to hide. She then gets startled as she sees that it's filled with human remains. The soldiers eventually catch up to her and enter the room, closing in on her. Paige screams. Meanwhile, the researchers reach the other end of the tunnel and find another hole. Moss still prompts to carry on and manages to climb down 100 feet before he unclips the harness. The group calls out to him but there's no answer. One of the researchers, Celia, who is also Riestad's love interest, volunteers to go down after Moss. As she descends, she eventually unclips the harness and slides down the icy hole. She sees Moss's coat and follows a bright light, eventually seeing him. She realizes that they're on a cliff overlooking what seems to be a different world under the ice. Paige is now strapped to the surgical table. She starts to talk to Mengele about possible remedies for the infection on the soldiers' decaying faces. Mengele begins to get interested in Paige because of her knowledge and because she has German blood, as well as being able to understand and speak a bit of German. The rest of the search party catches up with Celia and Moss. Riested begins to lecture them about how Hitler once sent expeditions to Antarctica and the theories of Nazis setting up a base in it. One researcher wonders how he would know all that information, and Riested simply says that he had been in Antarctica to learn about all the rumors. They begin to hike towards a building, but the effects of the heat start to hit them. Moss is eager to hurry up while May says that they're not aware of who they could be dealing with. Moss then tries to let them stay behind, but Celia protests, almost fainting. The group finds a warehouse where they enter before the door closes, and they are surrounded by the masked soldiers. Mengele appears and begins to thank Riested for bringing the group in. Riested salutes him and is revealed to have met the Germans 10 years ago after being caught and are on their side. Mengele then proceeds to describe how he survived by replacing his endoskeleton to avoid decay. One of the researchers then protests at their brutal methods, and Mengele identifies him as a Jew. He then kills the researcher using a futuristic enemy. He continues on to say that America and Russia had captured German scientists to benefit their own countries, but that Mengele was able to get them back. He then says that their research in the underground world has led them to come up with a plan to prolong their troops' lives by replacing their organs and bones, which were provided by Riested. Unlike the previous ones, the researchers now are asked to help them figure out how to properly do the transplants. Moss doesn't want to help, and Mengele aims his gun at him until Paige arrives, dressed in a similar uniform as Mengele. They whisper to each other before Paige walks to Moss and convinces him to follow the Germans' orders because their only other choice would be to die. The researchers are then locked up in the cell that Paige and Mark were previously in, and they start to fight. While Moss is still fighting to go against the Germans, the others are more submissive and prefer to give up so that they could stay alive. They walk toward the laboratory as Mengele, Riested, and Paige watch from a balcony. Moss steps out of line and tries to call out to her, but she turns away. A masked soldier then hits Moss to make him get back in line and walk. The soldier wearing Mark's face waits for them inside the lab. May thinks it's him and immediately runs towards him, but Moss pulls her back and tells her that that person isn't Mark. The soldier stands up and starts harassing them, with Moss stepping up to protect May. Mengele arrives and orders the soldier to stop and sit back down. Once the soldier follows, Mengele starts to introduce them to the lab, directing them to the research materials and instruments that they would need to help the soldiers adapt to their new organs. He states that Paige's earlier suggestion wasn't a complete solution, and Moss theorizes that it may be because the issue was different. Moss thinks that the soldiers weren't rejecting the organs but rather, were having an infection. He then injects the soldier with some antibiotics and advises them to not touch the surgical wound for it to be effective. Mengele then leaves them to work. May grabs a pair of scissors and secretly hands it to Moss. Once they're finished in the laboratory, one of the soldiers separates the men from the women, claiming that they were taking the women to the shower room. The three female researchers take off their coats and walk toward the room they were being led to as they hold hands. Once there, Celia lets go and walks to the side of the room. The soldier then tells them to take off their clothes, which May refuses. He then grabs onto the other researcher and smiles as he sees a tattoo on her wrist. The soldiers pull the other researcher away and begin to strip her clothes. Riested arrives, comforting Celia, before pushing May against a wall as he asks her what she and Moss were talking about earlier. He goes to scold her before Mengele arrives and has her taken to the operating room. Riested approaches Celia and tells her that she did the right thing, and takes her away from the room. Mengele tells the soldiers that they can have the third researcher. They start to approach her as she screams. Later, Moss sees Celia crying and asks if she was okay and where the other female researchers were. She doesn't answer and keep crying. Moss helps her up and they see a masked soldier push a bed with a body on it that was covered with a sheet. They then see the tattoo of the third female researcher on the neck of the soldier. Behind him, Mengele turns to Moss and tells them that they were about to witness history. Moss and Celia follow them into a room where a boiler-like machine stood in front of the Nazi flag. The bed was wheeled in and they discover that it was May under the sheet. The top part of her head had been removed and her brain was exposed. Moss protests once again and Riestad has him removed from the room. Riestad then proceeds to collect fluid from May's brain before injecting it into a machine. Mengele turns the machine on but eventually turns it off on its own. He yells at Riestad for the failure before pulling out May's brain and throwing it into the ground. He walks out after. Celia then throws up on the floor and Riestad gets angry at her. Celia then begins to tell him that she's pregnant. Riestad then begins to hug her and apologizes before knocking her out. She wakes up on the operating table, screaming. Mengele turns to Riestad and asks if he was sure that his new plan would work. Riestad says that he's not, but that there had been much research to prove the regenerative properties of fetal stem cells. He then starts to perform an abortion on Celia. Riestad and Mengele inject another substance into the machine and this time, their plan works. The boiler starts to form a robot-like body and reveals Hitler's head in a jar connected to that body. Mengele salutes Hitler, who calls out his name in a raspy voice. Meanwhile, the male researchers are led out to an area outside and they figure out that they're going to be killed. Robot Hitler then appears in the area and gives a speech before Mengele tells Paige and Riestad to prepare to perform surgery on the three researchers. One of them tries to escape but gets killed by Robot Hitler. A UFO emerges from one of the buildings. Once inside the operating room, Mengele tells Paige to not hesitate. He tells her that he will get Moss's face and that the two of them will become new leaders of the Fourth Reich. He gives Paige a scalpel but she uses it to slice his neck and release Moss. Moss then takes the scissors from his pocket and throws it at the other soldier, killing him too. They go to save the other researcher, who was being operated on by Riestad. He hears them coming and takes Celia away while the soldier with Mark's face fights Moss. With the help of the other researcher, they manage to beat the soldier before Moss tears off his face. The three head for the room where Mark is in hopes of bringing him along with them. Mark, however, begs them to kill him and Paige euthanizes him. They then leave to find a way to escape. Meanwhile, Robot Hitler instructed his men to destroy a nearby military plane before setting course to America. He is then informed that the three had escaped and caused an explosion downstairs. He tells his men to bomb every non-German country before he sets to find them. The three had managed to find a lifeboat but one of them is killed by Robot Hitler. Celia, who had enough of Riestad, takes a stick grenade from a soldier and detonates it in the control panel, killing the two of them and everyone in the room. The aircraft crashes and Moss and Paige quickly escape. They have one final fight with Robot Hitler, who they defeat by injecting a substance in the robot body. The movie ends with Moss proposing to Paige, which she accepts. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and also subscribe to my channel for more videos like this. See you in the next video.